So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming today, particularly today on when the universe has sent us such wonderful conditions, and the stalwarts that are here listening to what is one of the most important issues of our generation. Thank you so much for coming along, and I hope you will enjoy listening to an extraordinary collection of speakers who have such an important tale to tell. My name is Jacqui Hames. I'm one of the directors of Hacked Off. I was also a hacking victim, and something like 14 years ago, I gave evidence at the Leveson public inquiry. And almost immediately on publication of the recommendations from Lord Justice Leveson, I sat in Parliament as politicians from all the parties came together and agreed to introduce not only holding the second part of the Leveson inquiry, but also to implement a structure of independent press regulation in this country, which would have levelled the playing field and given the opportunity for freedom of speech across society. Sadly, 14 culture ministers and 6 prime ministers later, all those promises, all that work in Parliament, all that agreement, all those promises made to us as an organisation and to individual victims just fell away. I stood on the steps of the building next door, the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre, and read out a statement on behalf of Hacked Off when those recommendations were public, saying that we needed action now. And we still need action now, even if it is 14 years later. All those culture secretaries and all those prime ministers, many of whom made us promises in person that they would act, have reneged. We have had enough. And you'll hear from our speakers why we've had enough, because the situation has not changed. People's lives are still being affected. Our first speaker was one of the original gang of Hacked Off team who has championed publicly and privately this issue at great personal cost. He's our alternative Prime Minister for many reasons, and apparently quite a good actor as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please may I introduce Mr. Hugh Brandt.
Hello. Thanks, Jacqui, very much. And many congratulations on wearing a cardigan. She's not quite right in the head, never has been. Listen, I probably know everyone in this room anyway, so I keep this very short. There's better people coming after me. I just recap a few things for anyone who hasn't heard this before, and especially for Tulisa's Paramount cameras. I have never been in this because I'm worried about what happens to so-called celebrities. I don't think necessarily just because you're an actor or a singer or whatever that the press has the right to break the law around you, but I basically don't care about celebrities. I've never particularly liked celebrities. I hate people calling me one. My concern, back in 2010, there was a big dinner at L'Escargot, I think it was, in Soho, with everyone who was worried about this issue, who had spotted that the country was effectively being run by the editors and owners and apparatchiks of a few newspapers. And I'd seen it at sort of media parties in Notting Hill and felt physically sick watching the Rebecca Brookses of this world giving instructions to people who are meant to be our elected representatives. And I thought, this can't be right. I was also aware from personal experience that they had extraordinary power. They seemed to be living above the law. I knew that if my girlfriend got mugged and you called the police, the first person who turned up was not a policeman, but a journalist from The Sun. And what happened at that dinner was that it was generally agreed that although we were right, this would be something that would never move forward unless the public was scandalized by something. And then they were. The Millie Dowler thing broke, and Nick Davis did a wonderful job. The Guardian was heroic, and everything followed from that. We got together as Hacked Off. Pressure was put on government. Leveson inquiry was set up. We managed to get the right terms of reference. We managed to make it a judicial review, judicial inquiry. We got good recommendations, quite mild, but good ones. Another massive fight ensued with government and with Parliament, but we won. And both houses of Parliament voted for basically the Leveson recommendations. Big party out in the square there at the pub, marvellous victory. And then, under pressure from the big newspaper barons, Cameron chickens out, finds a way, finds a loophole, and the bill, the all-important bill, was never actually commenced. It's a technicality, and it was never commenced. So here we still are, all these years later, with these same people still running the country, still living above the law, still able to torment innocent and very often vulnerable people, some of whom we'll hear from later, in the name of corporate profit and the furtherance of their owners' political agenda. And we can't let it drop. And maybe now, as we switch leaderships of the Labour parties, switch prime ministers, maybe there's a chance finally to get something done. And all I'd say to whoever is the new prime minister is, when you're weighing up whether to do the right thing for the people against a massive corporation, when you're weighing up whether to protect vulnerable people from giant corporations and their agendas, or to cozy up to those giant corporations for your own political career, bear this in mind. Those media organizations are going to pour a bucket of shit over you, whatever you do, whether you support them or whether you don't. And if ever there was a case in point, it's Keir Starmer, who, last week was at the Murdoch summer party, pretty much wearing a bucket of shit. So this is a chance for someone new to be, in my opinion, a statesman instead of a politician, to govern instead of just playing Westminster snakes and ladders, to protect the public rather than protect vested interest. So let's hope this is a hopeful moment. It just might be. Who's next?
Thank you very much. One of our speakers, who we were very much looking forward to hear from, unfortunately has had to return to Liverpool, but she was very keen for you to hear her story. And if you allow me, I want to just read exactly what she would have said to you today. So hopefully you can hear me properly. I'm Charlotte, and I'm the daughter of Jimmy Hennessy, who was unlawfully killed at Hillsborough when I was just 6 years old. I'm here today to represent the Hillsborough Law Now campaign group. Our group is bursting to the seams with victims who've been affected by cover-ups, stated related deaths, and corrupt media outlets who targeted some of our campaigners like they were criminals. My disdain for corrupt media outlets is deep-rooted. I grew up in the knowledge that the Sun tarnished the miners of Shrewsbury 24 or Orgreave as a mob, and I watched as it initially downplayed the post office scandal. As the News of the World hacked the phone of Millie Dowler, and it repeatedly caused James Bulger's mum unnecessary distress, I have grown up in the shadow of the abhorrent article they released just 4 days after my dad and 96 other innocent fans were unlawfully killed. Journalists would hide behind cars to try and get my photograph. So my mum and dad had to take me to primary school late and pick me up early. I was just 6 years old. I was bullied at high school and told my dad and his mates were murderers. I was taunted that my dad's wallet was one of the things stolen by Liverpool fans. I have lived in that shadow of that article and of the Hillsborough my whole life. Fast forward to me being a 34-year-old adult, and I still bear the brunt of that article, when during the second Hillsborough inquests and having downtime with my family at a local pub, I was recognised and told, "I saw you on the news, don't know why you're bothering. They killed their own anyway." Now the impact is intergenerational, as I have to educate my own children about the lies that cloud over their granddad's killing. And they too have suffered ignorance as a direct impact of that article from the 19th of April 1989. Survivors of the Hillsborough disaster were wrongfully blamed, and the Sun newspaper was complicit. The pattern is continuous: speculation from facts, victim blaming, a sensational headlines before morals, failure to correct false reporting and putting those who abuse their positions of power before the voices of victims and families. There is no doubt that the coverage from the Sun contributed to the length of time it took to expose the truth about Hillsborough, and to me not knowing the truth of what happened to my dad until the Hillsborough Independent Panel released their report 23 years later. I've never had the opportunity to say this in an official capacity before, so don't buy the Sun. Thank you. And I think those words are very, very emotional and telling of a theme that goes through a lot of the victims from all walks of life. Our next speaker is Misan Harriman. Misan is an internationally renowned photographer, entrepreneur, and social activist, and has recently been victimized completely unfairly in the press.
Hi. Didn't know I was up next, but here we are. As someone that's currently living through a smear campaign in real time, over 25 articles written by numerous newspapers, including this nation's newspaper of record, where accuracy, harassment, and the racialized undertone of their words matter. I would say the words and the pen are akin to a weapon. And when handling a weapon, it needs to be a man or woman that has a moral compass, that thinks about the communities that we are trying to protect and build. The idea that the Fourth Estate is acting for the very corporations and institutions and political ideologies that are trying to keep us on islands of rage, instead of seeing the humanity in each other. The idea that I've become a target because I dare to speak out for the Muslim community and that I demand that there must never be children of a lesser God feels absurd to me. The Fourth Estate is supposed to be the last pillar of any democratic society that holds the powerful to account instead of acting for them. So I came to listen today to tell you a little bit about what I'm going through right now, but also to ask those that have access to the corridors of power, those that lobby, those that understand how best to make this country better, to hold the whole Fourth Estate to account, because impunity must not have dominion over accountability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Misan. We have a new speaker that we weren't expecting, but I'm very, very happy to welcome to the stage Alex Davies-Jones, apologies, MP, who would like to add a few words.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Alex Davies-Jones, the Member of Parliament for Pontypridd. And up until 3 weeks ago, until my resignation from government, I was the Victims Minister. It was my job to be a voice for those who don't get heard in the media or in the public square, in Parliament and in government. And I proudly got to know the Hillsborough families. You just heard Charlotte's testimony read out to you there. What she and the other survivors and their families have been through is nothing short of horrific. It is barbaric. It is unacceptable. But as well as the Hillsborough families, I also got to meet the infected blood families. All of these scandals. I met one man who told me that he had been outed in the press regarding his status as HIV as a result of the infected blood scandal. The press outed him. His neighbours then vilified him. He had to move, all because of that. Like, we can never forget the human cost and suffering as a result of all of this. My own dad was at Orgreave that day. He was a minor. There, he witnessed what happened and then subsequently saw the smears and the lies in the media around what happened that day to the minors. So this matters. And like Hugh said, we are going through a transition right now of government, of prime ministers, and I am hopeful. I am hopeful because things have to change. It has been far too long, but we have to keep going. And I have pledged to always be that voice for victims, because stepping down doesn't mean stepping back. And I will always ensure that their voices are heard by those who aren't the wealthy, the rich, the powerful, so that they always get a fair hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. And I promise I'll get everyone else's names right. Our next speaker is Richard Eyre. Richard is a media regulator, former BBC journalist and former member of the BBC Trust, which was the governing body of the BBC until its abolition in 2016. Would you welcome to the stage Richard Eyre?
Thank you. It's good to be here. I've just come from watching Keir Starmer's latest Prime Minister's questions. It was interesting that Kemi Badenoch chose not today to focus on Tory policy on carbon release. For reasons, those are obvious. After you've heard of Charlotte's experience there, and you will later hear Tulisa's experience, it seems strange for me to come here and say that things have got somewhat better. When I started in this business now 54 years ago, the press, the media as a whole, drove roughshod over people's personal privacy. For investigative journalists, entrapment was quite a common tool in the method of investigation, and for some newspapers, pandering to prejudice and discrimination set the editorial agenda because that was the way they increased their sales. Those behaviours are no longer endemic in the press, but they are still happening. And for those who are the victims, the pain is as great as it ever was. But the change that's come about has come about not because newspaper proprietors have suddenly grown a conscience, far from it, not because politicians have had the courage to stand up to them, far from it. Change has come about thanks to people like Charlotte, like Tulisa, like, forgive me, Hugh, celebrities who were prepared to stand up and say that they wouldn't pay the price of fame and fortune by surrendering their personal privacy. But also it's thanks to many, many people whose names, sadly, I can no longer remember, who had the courage to stand up, having been victims of press abuse. It came to the point under the Cameron years when politicians simply had to act, so he commissioned the Leveson Review. Leveson reported 14 years ago today, 14 years ago, Parliament, all parties in Parliament welcomed his proposals. Parliament voted to give ministers the power to implement those proposals in full. Yet it was 2 years after Leveson that Tulisa found herself in court thanks to entrapment and lies by the fake sheikh writing for The Sun on Sunday. The sheikh happily ended up in clink, but successive Tory leaders, under pressure from The Sun, from the Mail, from the Telegraph, abandoned their commitment to Leveson and failed to implement his proposals. And the Labour Party, decimated here at Westminster under Jeremy Corbyn, and desperate under Keir Starmer to gather public and press support, the Labour Party too abandoned its commitment to implement Leveson. Shame on both parties. Today we have a national press that largely claims to be independently regulated. Regulated by a body which is wholly financed to the tune of millions of pounds by the big press publishers. But who pays and how much each of them pays is a closely guarded secret. The regulator points out that it is not governed by the Freedom of Information Act, so it doesn't need to tell us. And its deals with individual news publishers are subject to one-by-one confidential negotiations. So much for independence. And it's a regulator with a difference. It isn't allowed to set the regulations. All of the rules for the way the press is supposed to behave are written by a completely separate body. It doesn't pretend to be independent. It is dominated overwhelmingly by, guess what, serving editors. The Leveson report has been consigned by both major parties to the cloud. Sir Brian Leveson, thank God, is still alive, but even so, he must be spinning. But the need for the UK to have printed, broadcast and online news services on which they can rely not just for what is said, but for how the news is produced is now more important than ever. Most UK adults now turn to social media as one of their main sources of news. For people under 35, social media is the main source of news. It's not the BBC, it's not ITV, it's not The Sun, it's not the Telegraph, it's not the Daily Mail. Facebook is the number one source of news for adults in this country. Facebook, condemned by Donald Trump in 2020 as, and I quote, the true enemy of the people, because Facebook allowed the reporting of the truth behind the invasion of the Capitol building. But 4 years later, Mark Zuckerberg was there on the presidential platform during Trump's signing in for what Trump thought was his third successive election victory. How could this enemy of the people, Zuckerberg, suddenly be such an honored guest on Trump's inauguration day? 2 weeks before Inauguration Day, Mark Zuckerberg made a speech. He said that fact-checking would no longer take place in America on either Facebook or Insta. When asked why, he said, fact-checking is too politically biased. How can it be politically biased to say Russia invaded Ukraine, not the other way around? How can it be politically biased to say that the COVID vaccine does not contain microchips? Western societies today are more polarized than at any time in my longish lifetime. In Britain, millions of people are passionate in their beliefs at the extremes of the spectrums, or spectra, which is it, on many key issues, on Brexit, on migration, on austerity, on the right to take your own life, assisted dying, and most obviously on Israel-Palestine. Of course, we must each be free to decide for ourselves where we stand on all of those issues. But in order to make those decisions, we have to be able to access some facts, not just other people's opinions. And this week, we've seen a vague plan from the outgoing Starmer government to give a special status to trusted news organizations. I don't know how they are to be measured or by whom, but trusted news organizations might be given prominence on internet searches, on search engines. You can bet your bottom dollar that all of the American big tech companies will fight tooth and nail not to implement any such plan. Why? Because it's clicks that matter, and in the business of news, the more ridiculous the news, the more unbelievable the news, the more unlikely the story, the more that story is tweeted, X'd, and retweeted, and circulated, and creates clicks. And clicks means bucks. So, here is an early test for the Burnham government. With a huge parliamentary majority, a personal track record of publicly supporting the public interest over the interest of big business. Frankly, what Andy Burnham decides he wants in the coming months, the Parliamentary Labour Party is bound now to deliver. So here's the test. Let's see whether Andy Burnham grasps the importance of securing a British press where truth still matters, where facts still matter, where honesty and decency still matter, and where individuals matter, and most of all, where the interest in an informed democracy matters. Thank you.
And if that's not a rallying cry, I don't know what is. Our next group of speakers have experienced firsthand what it's like to be intruded upon, have your phone messages read and listened to. Start us off is Benedict Rattigan, a writer, a philosopher, and a close friend of Paul McCartney and Heather Mills, whose phone was hacked during their divorce in 2006. And then he brought a claim against News International in 2006. Ben Rattigan.
Thank you, Jacqui. I'm aware that the aircon units are very loud, so I shall try to articulate so you can hear me clearly at the back. So I'm Benedict Rattigan. I'm director of an environmental ethics think tank, and I used to be a television producer. And about 20 years ago or so, in 2002, I think, Heather Mills and Paul McCartney invited me to make a behind-the-scenes documentary about their lives in the period leading up to their wedding. And in fact, the project fell through, but we became quite close friends. And over the next few years, from time to time, both Heather and Paul would phone me up, generally when they'd had some sort of an argument or a marital disagreement, just to have a chat, and I think to let off steam to somebody. These calls became increasingly frequent around 2006 when they separated and in the period leading up to their divorce. Now, what none of us knew at the time was that both Heather and Paul's phones were being hacked by the News of the World. And Ian Edmondson, who was then the editor of the News of the World, hired the private investigator Glenn Mulcair to hack my phone, which he did fairly extensively. And I was completely unaware of this at the time. Now, around this time, some vaguely absurd rumors started circulating around Fleet Street that I'd been having an affair with Heather Mills during their marriage. And some of the newspapers picked up on this story. And in response to that, early one Sunday morning, Heather phoned my now ex-wife from Los Angeles to say that the rumors of the affair were simply untrue and that we were friends and no more than that. And Heather then called me and left a message on my answer phone saying that she'd called my ex-wife. What we didn't realize was that this message was picked up, the message on the answer phone was picked up by Glenn Mulcaire. And he decided that Heather wouldn't have gone to the hassle and effort of denying an affair if it weren't true. So having passed this information on to News International, who were his employers, and being well paid for it, Glenn Mulcaire then sold the same bit of information to the Mail on Sunday, who ran a double-page spread calling me the third wheel in the McCartney's marriage. In order to research the piece, he worked alongside Greg Miskew, who turned up on my ex-wife's doorstep and in front of my 3 small children, who at that time I think were aged 4, 5, and 7, he announced that he had proof that I'd been sleeping with Heather Mills. My eldest daughter went into the sitting room and she rung me up and she said, "Daddy, there's a man at the door who says that you've been loving Heather." And consequently, my children, who were too young to sit down and sort of explain the complexities of adult relationships, they grew up believing that I had been cheating on their mother behind her back, which was an inexcusable thing to do. Greg Miskew later, when he was brought to trial for his various misdemeanors in terms of phone hacking, said, "That's what we do, we destroy people's lives." And he said that not in terms of self-reproach, but almost proudly. The double-page article that was very carefully worded and insinuated rather than explicitly stated that I was having an affair with Heather did significant damage to me and to my family. Now, I think it's important to point out that 70% of people whose phones are hacked are not celebrities. They're just ordinary folks like myself who were caught up somehow in a public story. Many celebrities are recognized for a wide variety of things. If you Google a movie star, there may be 3 or 4 million articles and pieces about them online about a wide variety of aspects of their life and work. If, however, you have somebody like myself, who is not a public figure, who is either a TV producer or an academic or whatever, and their footprint in Google is very limited, for many years after that Mail article appeared, if you Googled me, the only thing that really came up was the fact that I was the alleged lover of a pop star's wife, which was not something I welcomed. And it is true, I think, that non-celebrities who are victims of phone hacking and other forms of invasion by the press are every bit as damaged, if not more so, from the experience as are celebrities. And this isn't just something which celebrities have to live with. What I find quite galling about the whole thing, and the reason why I'm here today to talk about this, is my phone was hacked in 2006. And the police found out that my phone was being hacked in 2006 when they arrested Glenn Mulcaire, and they went through his notebooks. And there were many pages of notes relating to hacking myself, but there were also my children's details and details about friends of mine. There were my PIN numbers, goodness knows what, all sorts of information which Mulcaire had blagged ended up in his books. A lot of it very personal, and a lot of it potentially very damaging, such as PIN numbers if they were known to be in the public domain. But the police said nothing. They said nothing for 5 years. Eventually, I got a call from Operation Wheating saying, "Can we have a chat with you? We'd like to show you some notebooks that Glenn Mulcaire kept about hacking your phone." And I found it quite astonishing that the police should be nervous enough about disclosing this information because they didn't want to fall foul of News International or of the Mail. They knew that Mulcaire had passed on hacked information that he had hacked on behalf of News International. They knew that he'd pass it on to the Mail on Sunday because it was annotated in the notes. In fact, it even in the margin had the amount of money he was paid by the Mail on Sunday for that information. They knew that the Mail on Sunday had been involved in criminal activity, but they didn't want to upset the Mail on Sunday. In 2012, I think it was, I went with a group of other victims of phone hacking to meet David Cameron, and we also met the leaders of the other parties, and we laid out our case and asked for the support of the government. And Cameron said, we've got your back. If you go out publicly and you wish to make statements and write letters to the press and go on, make your concerns about the behavior of the press public, we will support you and we will have your back. But in the time leading up to the 2015 election, that support simply evaporated and we were left high and dry, and I have to say, extremely aggrieved. I believe strongly that we need Leveson Part 2, which would investigate the relationship between the press, the police, and politicians. Now, a cornerstone of democracy is freedom of speech. But with that freedom comes an equal measure of responsibility. You cannot have one without the other. And if the press continue to exercise their freedom of speech without also exercising an element of responsibility, they are jeopardizing that enormous privilege that they have. A society in which the police and elected government officials kowtow to a small group of unelected press barons is not, in my opinion, a democracy. The so-called press regulator, IPSO, does very little or almost nothing to protect the victims of press intrusion. Like its predecessor, the Press Complaints Commission, it's run for the benefit of the press, not the public. I believe that they uphold on average less than 1% of complaints that are presented to them, which is bizarre. Our nation deserves a free and responsible press. But with IPSO overseeing things in its current form, and the press effectively marking its own homework, I would suggest that is probably not going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben, and also for the last 14 years being such a stalwart supporter of this issue. Our next speaker, I'm delighted to introduce you to Lisa Moorish. Lisa, as some of you well know, is an English singer and songwriter and a vocal critic of UK media intrusion, specifically regarding her own experiences with phone hacking and press abuse. And I'm absolutely delighted that she's able to join us today to give you an idea of what she went through. Lisa. Thank you so much, Jacqui. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm going to be reading from something. I'm not one of those that can just off the cuff, I'm afraid. It's been brilliant to hear everybody, and this word celebrity that keeps coming up. I'm somewhere in between where people often tell me, the trolls, you're not even a celebrity, which kind of suits me. So the reality is it's every victim matters as much as the other. This is very important to say that. Thank you for having me today to speak. And I want to start with this. It was a quote from Zara Sultana. "It's a big club and you're not in it. Spotted at News Corp Chairman Lachlan Murdoch's summer party at Spencer House. Prime Minister Keir Starmer and his wife Victoria Starmer. Tory leader Kemi Badenoch and her husband. Former Secretary Wes Streeting, ex-Number 10 Chief of Staff. Morgan McSweeney, Reformed Treasury spokesman Robert Jenrick. Former Secret Intelligence Service Chief Richard Moore. Former Cabinet Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg, YouTuber Piers Morgan, and DMG Media Editor-in-Chief Paul Dacra. Will Andy Burnham now implement a Leveson 2 inquiry where Starmer and the Labour Party failed to meet our demands and deliver? For me, Starmer attending the Murdoch summer party is one of the worst betrayals to the British people, to me personally, and those in this room who have been victims of press abuse from The Sun, The Times, The Mail, and Telegraph. How can any politician or political leader rubbing shoulders with press barons be trusted in any way, shape or form? My dear friend, human rights activist, photographer and chairman of the Southbank, Misan Harriman, has recently been relentlessly targeted for weeks with multiple articles calling for him to be removed from his Southbank chair role due to his support
and call for children facing continued violence and death in Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon to end. They left out the fact he talks about and calls for oppression of all people and children around the world to end. Now, Misan happens to be a black British Nigerian heritage man. We all know the history of these papers and racism with the targeting of black and brown people at an overwhelmingly higher rate than the right-wing middle and upper classes say. Diane Abbott, along with other black and brown politicians, have also been targeted over the years. There is a consistent pattern here that cannot be ignored. Muslims are now one of the most targeted groups by these papers, where 2 apologies to 2 Muslim MPs for the Green Party were made by the Mail for misquoting and falsely accusing them of showing support for terrorism. Where other right-wing political figures, racist and misogynic behaviour is being ignored. The British press abuse towards certain groups continues with impunity. And it's not just racism at the majority of the legacy press, it's press as the attacks on, and the abuse of those from white working class backgrounds is also prevalent. I happen to be both, of black mixed race heritage and from a working class background. The right-wing press have been key in whipping up division and dividing the country in the past, and with it returning to the shameful divisive rhetoric today in 2026 that it was back then. It's worse than ever. This is so we don't look at them and their cosy elite billionaire club with their fancy tax evasion schemes. As for IPSO, which is controlled by the press, it is a complete sham, and we all know it. It receives between 6,000 and 8,000 complaints each year, and the vast majority are rejected or fall outside its remit. IPSO formally investigates a few hundred cases annually, typically upholding breaches of the editor's code in roughly 40 to 50 of those cases. IPSO must be replaced by a new regulator, and we must continue to push for this. So far, our calls for this have fallen on deaf ears, with both Tory and Labour governments in power since the phone hacking scandal, stalling and refusing to prioritise this urgent need. It's not near good enough, and press abuse victims have been let down at every turn, with very few seeing real justice. I grew up a Liverpool fan, and I remember the front cover of the Sun story on Hillsborough. I was 17 years old. Being on a panel, she's obviously absent, with Charlotte Hennessy calling for an end to press abuse was not on my bingo card. I'm so proud to stand in solidarity with her and all the other speakers today. Let's keep up the fight, continue to grow this movement until real change is made. No justice, no peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's hard to quantify the number of areas of our lives and the people this issue affects. Our next speaker is Mark Cann. Mark is a charity leader and also a victim of phone hacking, and again has been a stalwart supporter of Pactov for many years. Please welcome to the stage Mark Cann.
Thank you very much. Before Hugh has a go, I'm wearing a jacket to avoid being a Tony Blair. And respect to Hugh and all the speakers, because speaking out on this issue is really requires bravery indeed. And I have a lot of time and respect for those. Like many people here today, I had my phone hacked. I was not and am not a celebrity. I was merely a soldier doing his job. But since being hacked, I've never used the expression, no smoke without fire, because the smoke is the press ammunition and the smoke is toxic. All right. Like all of us here, I was given assurances by politicians and that lessons would be learned and reforms would follow. The victim test was all that mattered. And forgive repetition, because we are banging a drum. We've been banging it for 14 years, and I will bang it again, but very briefly. Those promises were made. Leveson in 2012 said that for the 7th time in less than 70 years, a report has been commissioned by the government which has dealt with concerns about the press. And despite all of that, many of the same concerns identified in the 40s, the 60s, the 70s, the 90s, and again by Leveson in 2012 remain unresolved. Press abuse continues, and the press mark their own homework. Yet here we are.
So today is not about the victims we know today, but it's really about those of tomorrow. The evidence has been gathered. Endless inquiries have reported. The recommendations have been written. The victims have spoken. The public has listened. The question today is no longer whether that there was wrongdoing. The question is whether our political leaders have the courage and integrity to do what they said they would do. What makes the issue particularly frustrating is that Britain already understands the principle involved. When the police get things wrong, there's an independent regulator. When banks get things wrong, there is independent oversight. When lawyers get things wrong, there is independent oversight. When doctors get things wrong, there is independent oversight. We recognize the powerful institutions require independent accountability. So why should the press be different? Why should one of the most powerful institutions in our society be permitted to regulate itself and mark its own homework? This is not an attack on press freedom. None of us want that. The free press is essential. But freedom without accountability is not freedom. It's privilege. It is a privilege. No institution should be privileged beyond the law, nor have the license to intimidate with impunity. And for a democracy, this is really the important issue of our time. What concerns me most is not what happened to me, it's what our response or non-response to it says about us today and what that means for the victims of tomorrow. We live in a time when trust in institutions is fragile, to say the least. Trust in politics is fragile, trust in the media is fragile. Social media has amplified division, anger, and misinformation, and politics itself. People are looking for leadership. They are looking for honesty. They are looking for integrity. And leadership is not demonstrated by doing what is easy. Leadership is demonstrated by doing what is right. Politicians are rarely rewarded for difficult decisions in the short term. They are respected for them in the long term. That is why today is not simply about victims seeking justice. It's about whether promises made by elected representatives and parties collectively mean anything. It's about whether Parliament is prepared to stand up for the public interest when powerful interests oppose it. And it is about whether our leaders are willing to act on principle they themselves have repeatedly endorsed. We need to be lateral and inventive in how we help them and do that. Perhaps the press itself could do the right thing. They accept the principle of a regulator. They just want it to be their regulator. The case has been made. The evidence is there. The recommendations exist. The public support is evident. What is missing is political action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Our next group of speakers have experience of the press regulator that was set up by the press themselves after the publication of the Leveson recommendations, and each one can talk to a different aspect of what their experience was of it was. Our first speaker is Paul Wragg. Paul is a professor of media law at the School of Law at the University of Leeds. He's a leading expert on privacy law and press regulation, and he's also a former member of the Code Committee at IMPRES, the other regulator which does, of course, hold itself accountable to the Leveson recommendations. And he's also a regular contributor to Inform. So please welcome to the stage Paul Wragg.
I'm trying to read nothing into the fact that so many people have just left. Clearly, they've heard me speak before. I'm a director at Hacktoff. I'm a professor of media law, but I'm also a victim of press intrusion, and I empathise with everyone in this room. The Leveson report extended to over 2,000 pages, but within it was a single phrase that for me captured the entirety of why we're here today. And that was because Leveson recognized that press malpractice causes real harm to real people. That phrase, for me, has a very powerful duality to it. It recognizes that the victims of press malpractice are generally people without a public profile. They are what we might call ordinary people. At the same time, it recognizes that when the press targets celebrity, it does so by leaning into the trope that celebrities are not real people, that they are objects for them to use as they please. And so, for me, Leveson represents a promise. The very word Leveson is a byword for that promise. A promise to effect real change, to ensure that this real harm to real people ends. That has not happened. It has not happened because the promise has been broken, first by our elected officials, and secondly, by the regulator that was set up in the wake of the Leveson inquiry, IPSO. A regulator that barely deserves the word regulator, for it is a sham, as we all know. To understand why that change hasn't happened, we shouldn't be thinking simply in terms of what's gone on over the past 16 years. We should be thinking about the last 80 years, because it's over that time period that successive governments have said they will do something about press malpractice, and it's over that time period that they've let us down. They've let us, the British public, down. They haven't kept their promises. They have instead leaned into favours for their friends, people that they hang about with at parties. We've already heard about the failings of IPSO. Despite the fact that it receives over somewhere in the region of 6,000 to 10,000 complaints every single year, only 1%, in fact less than 1% of those complaints end in a successful adjudication. And what does that adjudication represent? Nothing. It's barely a slap on the wrist. It's an admonishment by a regulator that was set up by the industry and for the industry, and is overseen by that same industry. We're going to hear from other victims of press malpractice and their experiences of IPSO. But I want to finish on a positive note. There is something we can do about this. We can have the tough regulator that we were promised. It will not be a betrayal of press freedom for that to happen. But it's only going to happen if politicians are brave enough to stand up for us. And we need to remind those politicians of the lie that we, the British public, have been sold. And the lie is that tough press regulation suppresses press freedom. That tough press regulation is a return to a system of licensing. It is something that only despots would do. We know that this is a lie, and the lie is compounded by what IPSO says, because IPSO says that it is a tough regulator, and IPSO says it can be a tough regulator but still uphold the right to freedom of speech. So which is it? Either it's not possible to have tough regulation because that would be an end to press freedom, or we can have tough regulation. That's the lie that we need to challenge. That is the challenge for us, but it's the challenge for our politicians. Thank you very much for coming today and for your support for Hackshot.
Thank you so much, Paul. Our next speaker is Emily Brothers. Emily is a British Labour politician, first openly transgender Labour Party candidate to run for Parliament. If you just give her a few moments to come to the stage, and has been a stalwart of a supporter of Hacked Off after her, explaining her own experience of working with the press as a politician.
Thank you, Jacqui, to the Hacked Off team for today's rally and for all of you for coming along today, demonstrating your support for justice. I think it's vital that politicians are honest and open about their history. And that's why I took the difficult decision in 2014 to come out about my gender identity, a very difficult journey, because it is important that politicians are authentic. I did so and received widespread positive coverage, except for one source. And growing up in Liverpool, it was unsurprising that it came from the Sun. The columnist asked, being blind, how did you know they were the wrong sex? In another publication the following day, I asked a columnist, when you go to bed at night and turn out the lights, how do you know you're a man? There wasn't an answer, and I think he's still trying to work it out. So I basically brushed it aside, thinking it was just more rubbish from this particular publication. But the pushback from the public was significant. Yes, in support of me in terms of my journey, but the wider community who feel excluded, and indeed since have become more excluded by toxicity in the media. And as a result of that, not standing up for me particularly, but for the wider community, with the support of Hacked Off and Transmedia Watch, I took forward a collective complaint with Transmedia Watch, and IPSO, surprisingly, upheld that complaint, saying it was indeed pejorative, and asked for an apology, which came without the due prominence that we would expect, and indeed came with a ridicule again, with a Monty Python sketch, changing the name Tarquin to my dead name, which basically revealed who I had been before going through a legal protected process. This is transphobia. This is about division. And it was undermining me as a woman and indeed a disabled woman. So politicians should indeed have scrutiny, but we also need to have the integrity to stand up for the public and not side with the owners of the press. And whilst I moved forward, it was very clear to me that increasing negative media coverage has a real serious impact on the lives of trans people, but also on their families, on their colleagues, and also fuels the division that is bringing about hostility and division. And this is not helped by the fact that trans people do not have a voice in the media, in political life at large, or in wider public life. And therefore, we need a fairer system to regulate the media. Because what we have now is a pervasive media content without the right to rebuttal, without the guidance that will ensure fairness. I have been a member of the Labour Party for nearly 46 years, and I understand we're going to have a new leader and Prime Minister, most likely in Andy Burnham. And he, like me, has been involved in the last year supporting a group within the party called Mainstream about bringing Labour values and principles into policy so that we actually govern with a purpose, have power that is linked to our principles. And so we're going to use this moment as a reset. There's no better way in doing and bringing about that radical change, because independent press regulation fits with that kind of agenda to bring about a fairer Britain, supporting ordinary people and not the press barons and powerful interests. And so I certainly will be working within the Labour Party, continuing to work in order to bring those things about. It's not about stopping freedom of speech or the like, or candour. It is about giving everybody respect. It's about giving voice to those who are excluded. Whilst my initial complaint against IPSO was upheld, the second one, where they used my dead name, was not. They would not countenance it. And that's simply because the former dealt with attitude and the other was about discrimination and it's a systemic situation that we encounter. IPSO is controlled by the press. It is a sham organisation and it should be urgently replaced by a proper regulator, truly independent. Politicians should have the integrity to stand up for the public, not the press owners. That does take courage, and it also means developing trust. I know something about going through transition and how difficult change can be, and that is what political life, if we're going to bring about change, involves in terms of being determined, showing trust. At the end of the day, Britain deserves better press than we have today. Not only does Britain deserve a better press system, but everyone in our society deserves respect. And you, supporters, particularly those who have been abused or undermined by the press, you deserve justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. The word courage keeps coming up, and I think you've seen that exemplified. Our next speaker will be very familiar to you as a wonderful and international and very successful broadcast singer and also a presenter on television. But today she's here to talk about another side of her life. And again, it comes back to courage, doesn't it? And we're very, very proud and grateful for Tulisa, who's coming here today to talk about her experiences.
Hello, everyone. I will confess I have severe public speaking anxiety, so please excuse me if I don't look up. But I promise you, I speak the truth and nothing but. Well, hello, vegan. Okay, so my name is Tulisa Contostavlos. I have been in the public eye since I was 17 years old. And for most of that time, I've known what it feels like to be on the wrong end of British press coverage. Headlines built on misogyny, classism, and slander. Stories built on lies. But in 2013, something happened to me that no amount of time, no amount of counselling, and no amount of redemption can ever undo. I was set up over 6 months. A journalist working undercover for The Sun on Sunday made me believe I was about to land a £3.5 million film role. They flew me around the world first class. They put me up in nice hotels. I took endless meetings with them, and they introduced me to endless characters, assistants, accountants, lawyers, and producers. It seemed professional and legitimate, but I would later find out that it was all a lie, that they were the actors. They manipulated me based on my background. The role was a heightened version of my life, rough, streetwise, a little bit ghetto. A nurturing, motherly assistant who knew a lot about my childhood and trauma from reading my autobiography played on this. She told me she cared for me and that I deserved the part to better my life and myself. So I played the role I was told to play. After 6 months, I gave them a number of an acquaintance who was then also under the impression he would be helped with his career in film. And so he found a connection to drugs. I had no knowledge of the contacts. They ordered £800 worth of cocaine. And then the headline dropped. Tulisa's cocaine deal shame. Front page of every newspaper in the country. No mention that I had been set up. Why? I have no idea. And what's worse is due to the ongoing court case, I couldn't defend myself publicly. And I was now facing 8 years in prison. I lost my home. I lost my job on the X Factor. I lost my entire career and my personal love life relationship. My reputation was destroyed in seconds, and the legal process that followed took 2 years, during which I wasn't able to explain what had really happened. I was only acquitted because one of the journalist's own colleagues came forward and admitted the reporter had lied. During those 2 years, journalists camped outside my home. There were times I would turn on the TV and see my own home live on the news. It was all-consuming and genuinely terrifying. Strangers threw eggs at my property. I was verbally and physically abused in public. And later, I discovered I'd also been a victim of phone hacking. And that my mother's medical records and my own childhood social services files had been accessed and exposed to people who had no right to them. In 2016, I hit rock bottom. I attempted to take my own life. I tell you this not for sympathy. I tell you this because I survived it, and because I think of my dear friend, Caroline Flack, who didn't. This isn't only about celebrities. The press goes after ordinary people too. People with no platform, no lawyers, or the money, or no way to fight back. Before I go on, I want to recognize some of the other people whose lives have been irreparably damaged by the press. Your strength is part of why I'm standing here. This week, I met Mandy Gardner. Her daughter, Anisha, was tragically killed, and the Mail published CCTV of her final moments under a clickbait headline. Mandy complained, her complaint was dismissed. That is not an isolated failure. That's the system working exactly as it's designed to. This pattern of press intrusion and abuse does not stop on its own. It never has. So many individual lives have been ruined. But the press also impacts on all of us every single day. It impacts the way we see the world, the way we see each other, our social consciousness, and who and what powers govern us. The press is powerful, and the weight of that impact should be respected, with regulation that protects us all. In 2012, the Leveson Inquiry recommended an independent body be enforced on all print media, similar to that of broadcast media. That advice was ignored. IPSO, which is supposed to regulate the media, was created and funded by the newspapers themselves. It is not independent. In over 10 years, it has never fined a single newspaper and upholds just 1% of complaints brought to it. This is about fairness and learning from what's already happened before another life is ruined or lost. I'm not here for revenge. I don't believe the press as a whole is the enemy. But in any powerful industry, there will always be people willing to destroy others for profit. Without real accountability, nothing stops them doing it again. What I've learned is that this isn't a matter of bad people. It's a matter of a system that lets this happen and keeps letting it happen every day. Right now, there is a deep and dangerous lack of trust between the press and the public it is meant to serve. And where there is mistrust, there is division. Imagine a Britain where people actually trusted the press to tell them the truth. Imagine how much else we could fix if we could rebuild that trust. I don't know of any other industry in this country with this much power over people's lives where the regulator is funded by the very organisations it is supposed to regulate. A regulator that in over a decade has fined precisely 0 of them. And I don't know of any unchecked power anywhere in history that has ended well for the people it was supposed to serve. We have to fight for what's fair in every part of our system. The way the press treats the people belongs at the very top of that list. Soon I will be launching a campaign calling on the government to introduce and enforce truly independent press regulation to ensure what happened to me and so many others doesn't happen again. Thank you for standing with me.
Thank you so much, Tulisa. Don't think I can add anything to that. But our next speaker has an experience every bit as moving as Tulisa's story. Danielle Hindley is coming now, next speaker, and she was featured in a story on the Mail on Sunday about cosmetic cowboys, which actually changed her life. Please welcome to the stage, Danielle Hindley.
Hi, I'm Danielle Hindley. She's already started me off because I was crying listening to Tulisa. In 2017, I was a single mum. Sorry. I'm really tired today, that's why I'm crying, sorry. I was a single mum. I was self-employed, working from home, offering hair, nails and beauty treatments to clients. I didn't claim a single penny for benefits. And I'd created a nice little life for me and my little boy. A journalist I didn't know at the time came into my home undercover with a hidden camera, filming me and my son. She actually managed to get footage of my son in his underwear because he was in his home. I later realised that she was a journalist and made contact with her to say, sort of like, understand what she was trying to do. And she sent me a really short text message that just said, if you've got a problem, email my editor. I emailed the editor at the time, John Wellington, and I was ignored for over a month. He didn't reply to my email until after they'd already published the article about me. They did email me a right to reply, and they listed all the allegations they wanted to make about me. They were calling me a rogue beautician, cosmetic cowboy. They said that I'd disfigured somebody's face. They said that I was unqualified, uninsured, unlicensed, unaccredited. None of this is true. I've got 100% 5-star reviews on every platform you can look at. I'm qualified, I'm insured, I'm licensed, I'm accredited. I've worked in the industry since I was 16 and I'm 41 now, so this is my whole career. Even though they sent me a right to reply, and even though I sent them all the documentation proving that every allegation they wanted to make against me was untrue, they published the article anyway. While the journalist was in my home, she was trying to lead me into acting in ways that weren't professional. For an example, she told me that she was allergic to lidocaine. Lidocaine is one of the main ingredients in numbing cream, and she was having a skin tightening treatment above her eyes. I told her that the treatment was really painful and I wouldn't want to do the treatment if I can't numb her, and I can't numb her because she's allergic to the main product. And she was saying things like, just do it anyway, it'll be fine. I didn't. But they did publish the article anyway with all of those allegations saying that I did all of those things. That I was all of those things. It was a big double-page spread. It had my photo in it, my full name, the name of the village that I lived in. And it was all over the internet. I live in like a little village. One of my neighbours spat at me because she said I brought a shame on the village. That's just one example of how I was treated afterwards. To start with, I didn't really know where to go, and then I found IPSO, the Independent Press Regulator. And I was sort of hopeful because, you know, there's the financial ombudsman, there's all these different ombudsmen and regulators, and I thought, these guys will sort them out. I was making a complaint based on 2 of the breaches of their own code. So remembering that IPSO are run, funded, managed by their own people. They've wrote their own rules. The first 2 clauses, one is accuracy, and the second one is privacy. Where it details privacy, about not going into somebody's home, about not doing something that would infringe on somebody's personal family life. They breached both of those first 2 codes. I didn't even need to go any further. So I made the complaint. Not long after I made the complaint, it was very clear that they weren't only impartial, but they were absolutely not on my side. One example of that, they gave me 7 days to put together over 2,000 pieces of evidence that I had, screenshots of conversations that I'd had with the alleged client who had apparently disfigured her face. All kinds of documentation, qualifications, everything. But there was over 2,000 items I had to put together. They said I had 7 days to do that. I was so mentally ill. From that, I couldn't get out of bed, make a cup of tea, never mind do that. One of my friends stayed over every night for a week and we did somehow manage to do it. And then they gave the Daily Mail 30 days just to reply. I had to do all that in 7 days and they had 30 days just to reply. They didn't reply in 30 days. They asked for an extension at the end of the 30 days. I asked for an extension on the 7 days before I even started. I said that's impossible and I was told no. They asked for an extension at the end of the 30 days and they were told, yeah, that's fine. Because John Wellington had a day off that week. There were more than 4 weeks in that month. Doesn't everyone have a day off? I certainly wasn't having a day off from that whole experience. It It took around 8 months, start to finish, with a complaint. My complaint is one of the under 1% where they upheld the complaint. However, they didn't uphold both parts. They upheld the accuracy. They couldn't really not. But what blew my mind is the first part in their code under privacy says that they can't interfere with somebody's home or family life. I was a single mother of a little boy living in that house alone with my child. They came into my home with a hidden camera under a false identity and filmed me and my son in our own home. I can't imagine any other infringement of my privacy. But they didn't rule in my favour on that. I just accepted it because I kind of took the accuracy part as a win. They told me that the Mail were going to print a correction on page 2 of the Mail on Sunday that week. And I was so excited that I was going to show everyone, I told you I was telling the truth, except it wasn't there. It turned out it was really far back in the newspaper, but I couldn't even find it. And when I complained to IPSO about that, they said, oh, sorry, they did let us know they had a more important story about Harry and Meghan. That story wasn't more important to me. I mean, I love Harry and Meghan, but that story was not more important to me. And when it's a big double-page spread and all I was entitled to was this tiny little sentence, it would have been really nice if they'd have put it where they were told to be put it. They didn't put it on page 2 because they knew that IPSO is run by them. They had no reason to. They know that there's no sort of punishment for not doing as they've been told because it's their mates that are ruling on that. The day that they made the decision on my case, they said, don't worry, the editor from the Mail won't be in the room while we're making the decision on yours. And I remember thinking, why would he be in the room anyway? Because I didn't know. Not only did they not publish it on page 2 because they knew that they wouldn't get in trouble from IPSO, but they also knew that there'd be no backlash from the government either. Because, let's face it, the government haven't done anything to put some proper regulation in place. I did end up suing the paper, and it cost nearly £500,000 in legal fees that I didn't have. I was just really lucky that I found a hero that just knew that I needed him. But no amount of money that I ever would have been awarded would have made that situation right. I tried to take my own life on more than one occasion. My son's school called me to ask me if everything was okay at home because they could see he wasn't okay. I was his mum and I couldn't even see that because I was too lost in my own mental health. The Daily Mail looked at me when they wrote that story and they knew it wasn't true because I'd already emailed them. They didn't care. They looked at me and saw a single working class mum and they didn't think I could do anything about it. They were wrong about that. Unfortunately, they weren't wrong about the government and IPSO not doing anything about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janelle. And it does take a huge toll on people telling these stories over again, but that has to mean something, which is why we're all here today. Our next speaker is Corinne Fowler, an author who faced abuse following articles written about her by The Telegraph and The Spectator about a book she had recently being published. So please welcome to the stage, Corinne Fowler. Hello, I'm a professor of colonialism and heritage, and now I'm an elected representative councillor in Birmingham. I received press abuse for 5 years, and it was rightly described as an experience of walking on the pavement and having a juggernaut coming towards you, and I had every right to be on that pavement.
What happened to me was that I was commissioned by the National Trust to write a report about National Trust properties and their connections to the British Empire, and that included the sensitive subjects of historic transatlantic slavery. And all that report was just an audit of all published peer-reviewed research. So it was just quite a factual document, which was then published by the National Trust. And that report won a couple of awards. It was a very high-profile report. So what happened to me was that this got weaponised, and Jacob Rees-Mogg made a speech in Parliament saying that I was denigrating British history, and then 56 Common Sense Group MPs and peers then went to my funder and said that my project was a political project and public money must not be used for political projects, when in fact it was a very well regarded child-led history and writing project that they were referring to. And then the Telegraph reported that I was to be given no more public money. But basically what happened was that I found myself in the middle of Britain's first modern culture war, and I became a hate figure. So the Common Sense group of MPs wrote open letters about how the National Trust and myself and my team of female historians, because that comes into it as well, we're denigrating British history, unpatriotic and so on. And the news attacks were really alarming to me. I mean, I knew it was a sensitive topic and I was prepared to do it anyway, but there were questions about my intellectual heft. A picture of me on Facebook was taken of a bird on my head and used in a Daily Mail article to try and ridicule me, make me look ridiculous. There were assertions by Restore Trust, which really had a lot of these publications on their side, that the report was error-strewn without ever providing any evidence. And then the only time evidence was provided was that it was actually found to be an error on a website written by somebody else. The Times led with an article which then spread across the media saying that I had led and was a politically biased academic. And there were some absurd reports about a book that I'd written. There was a headline that I had supposedly said, "Gardening is racist." It was just absolutely a distortion of all the sensible evidence-based work that I was doing. So what happened as a result of that, every time one of these online articles was published, I received a wave of hate mail threats. I couldn't walk alone. I couldn't go to my office. I was approached and threatened by somebody in person as I tried to get the train in Birmingham New Street. My son read, he was about 13, 14 at the time, unbeknown to me, went to the articles, read beneath the article comments, which are unregulated, and read all sorts of hate speech about me. You know, I should be slapped till my teeth clattered together. I was a witch. I should be burned at the stake. Really, really gendered stuff. And no child should ever have to read hate speech about their own parent, especially not somebody of integrity and a very serious person. And for me, none of this is about reporting. It's what happens when newspapers become a mouthpiece for the powerful. And I was given no right of reply in 99% of the cases. As I say, this went on for 5 years. It still goes on now sometimes today. There was a complete disregard for my safety, my personal safety, for my reputation, which was very hard earned. only 1 in 10 academics who are female become professors. The gendered nature of the coverage was of the nature that so many women, and especially people of colour, have experienced, which discourages people from entering or daring to enter into public life. It's all about, the newspaper just feels like we'll set the dogs on you, and they set the dogs on me for sure. So for me, politicians have to show courage. What's the point in going into politics if you're not going to change something and you're just going to play games and get stuck in the game playing? We talk a lot about freedom of speech, which is, of course, a sacred principle, but I think you have to think about the volume, the audibility of speech. Who has the megaphones and who has no platform or a very small platform in comparison? So for me, people attempted to silence me in the name of freedom, and I mean, fortunately, I'm still here to tell the tale, and it's only made me stronger, and I did push back against it, but not everyone is prepared to fight that kind of fight or has the circumstances in life where they are able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corinne. And finally, in this group of speakers, we have another extraordinary story that you wouldn't have imagined could have happened. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Aidan Kelly, who's a clinical psychologist and director of transgender healthcare provider Gender Plus. And his experiences of how the Daily Mail have portrayed his work and the whole issue of transgender issues in the public domain. So, Dr. Aidan Kelly.
Thank you very much. Much of what you're going to hear from me is, similar themes and similar kind of content to what other people are telling you about. I guess the thing that maybe is a little bit more different about my story is how comparatively, it's a bit more recent. So hopefully, what the message I hope that conveys, or the lesson there is from that, is that the press behaviour is not changing, it's continuing, and it will continue to happen unless we get a proper regulator. So as said, I'm Dr. Aidan Kelly. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've specialised in trans healthcare, and I've delivered and worked in NHS gender clinics for over a decade. In the past couple of years, I've been in independent practice. Where my story starts, I suppose, is about 12 to 18 month period over 2023 and 2024. And that's when there was a kind of a harassment and libel kind of pursuit from the Daily Mail. So there was a number of articles written about me, my name and my face and my picture kind of splashed all over the Daily Mail and the Mail Online, with a number of untrue and reputationally damaging articles. The way that started off was the Mail trying to entrap me in my clinic by booking fake appointments, pretending to be children who were trying to access treatments and things that we didn't even provide, but by doing so without the parental consent. And so we were kind of having to cancel appointments, that these kind of very obviously fake referrals, but they were fake. And the reason we knew it was the Daily Mail was because despite them being different profiles, they were the same credit card and the same name on the credit card, which matched that of Daily Mail editor each time. So they weren't learning their lesson. But luckily, we were able to catch those and weed those ones out. And that built up to the point that they were then turning up outside my clinic. This is a clinic where we share a building, but there's ourselves and other kind of businesses or clinics in that space are seeing youth. It's a kind of a youth space. So there's children coming in and out. And so one day I turn up, someone warned me in advance that there was journalists outside, photographers peering through windows, trying to take photos, basically trying to doorstep me, and it didn't matter who was going to get in their way. Where this culminated, I suppose, is in April 2024 with a news piece which basically said that me and my colleagues were doling out puberty blocker medication to children. And besides the fact that I'm a psychologist, I can't prescribe any medication at all. That simply didn't matter. I wrote to IPSO, I complained, I went through a long process of trying to explain the case, why this was simply untrue and why it was libelous. Because this is me, if that was true, I'd be breaking the law and I could easily wind myself up in serious trouble. IPSO, even though it dragged out over 6 months, found in favour of the Daily Mail somehow. And so they didn't see any grounds in my complaint. Thankfully, that's when the group, when Hacked Off got in touch with me, said they thought I hadn't, still had merits in my case, and linked me with a very competent and professional legal team that were able to help me then launch legal action against the Daily Mail. And ultimately, prior to trial, we were able to reach a very favourable settlement in advance of that, which meant I had a wonderful summer that summer. But it shouldn't be down to private citizens to have to launch their own legal cases and basically sue big, large media corporations to try to get the record set straight. And this is the role of a regulator, and that should be an independent body that should be doing that as a matter of course. And so until that is the case, until there is proper regulation, British public, we're not safe of media abuse at all. And so, yeah, that's my story, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Aidan. So, we all know it's time for the government to act, to see if we can really make some meaningful change at last. Our next two speakers have huge experience in this area. Our first is George Eustice, who's a British politician, former PR executive, who held office as Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs between 2020 and 2022. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that, he's been a huge supporter and promoter of these issues for many years. Please welcome George Eustice.
Well, thank you very much, Jacqui. I know we've had some incredibly powerful, very personal testaments from people this afternoon about the importance of this agenda that we're all pursuing. And I'm conscious that some of you might be asking, what's a Conservative doing here on this particular agenda? And the reason I'm here, and the reason that I've always supported Hacked Off, and the reason that I campaigned for the introduction of the Leveson framework all those years ago, wasn't despite being a Conservative, but because I'm a Conservative, and because I believe there are some issues that should be cross-party, non-partisan, those issues that relate to the decency of our society, the quality of our debate, the quality of our democracy, should be above party politics. And on a good day, good politicians will show integrity. And on a good day, politics is capable of advancing concepts of accountability and standing up against vested interests and in favour of the underdog. And on a good day, politics can sometimes take difficult decisions. But I emphasise on a good day because I'm afraid to say that for my party, and actually for every other party to date, it has generally not been a good day when it comes to the issue of how we regulate and govern press. And the reason for that is often when this issue comes up, courage tends to become absent, cowardice tends to prevail. And we've got to try and find a way of breaking through that and find somebody who's willing to do the right thing. Because as Paul Wragg said earlier, there has been a very long history of last chances for the press. As long ago as 1949, there was the first Royal Commission that recommended a system of regulation. A few years later, nothing had happened. There was a private member's bill. That was withdrawn in 1953 to give the press one last chance. By 1962, they needed another Royal Commission. That concluded that there should be one last chance, just one last chance for the press, with the absence of which there would be some regulation. And by 1977, there was a third Royal Commission. This time it was one final chance. And then by 1990, there was another review into the press in which they said this is positively the last chance, which brings us through to 2011 and the Leveson inquiry, which came about because of this long, long history of last chances and failure that followed.
The Leveson inquiry happened because people were absolutely horrified that Millie Dowler's phone, that murdered schoolgirl, had been hacked. And more horrified still to find that there were a cascade of similar stories that followed after that episode, and huge new revelations about the inappropriate closeness between the press and the police on individual cases, and certainly as well between the press and the political system. Now, the Royal Charter that was put in place following the Leveson inquiry was a proportionate system to move things forward. The editors would still essentially write their own code, but they would no longer be free to adjudicate on their own code. The crucial thing was there would be independent regulation. And crucially as well, there was to be a system of independent arbitration. And this system wasn't to help politicians to complain about the press. Politicians don't need that. They have PR people who can manage their relationship with the press. I did it myself for a number of years. You have remedies in politics. If you are treated really badly by the press, you can decide not to do interviews with them in future. You have a remedy of sorts in politics. Nor was it there to help the rich and famous because they got deep enough pockets to be able to access lawyers. No, the system that was put in place was to help those who had neither wealth nor power, but often found themselves thrown into an environment that they weren't familiar with no redress whatsoever for the things being done to them. And usually these were cases of people who had suffered terrible tragedy and personal bereavement in their own lives. Now, we hear quite a lot about the importance of freedom of speech, and I couldn't agree more. But we have to ask a question. In our current system, where is the actual freedom of speech for a journalist who might disagree with their own editor or their own proprietor? But I can tell you, I spent a lot of time pacing up and down the corridors of the press gallery in Parliament, and the answer is there's not much freedom for a journalist to go against something when his own editor and proprietor are barking at them down the phone to write something they know to be untrue. And how about this for freedom of speech? When IPSO was formed, the industry's press regulator, its first chairman was somebody called Alan Moses. And I met him and I said, why don't you just sign up to the Royal Charter architecture? You're nearly there, you're getting there. At least go along with the system. And he said to me, George, I completely agree. IPSO should seek recognition under the recognition panel process. But he said, I'm not allowed to say so because it goes against my terms of my contract. I'm not allowed to say this. So here we had the first chairman of this so-called independent regulator banned, subject to a gagging order, if you like, by the press themselves from saying what he actually believed should happen by way of press regulation. You know, how is that for freedom of speech? Now, if you had a system of accountability with independence, I think you would create a culture that empowered journalism, good journalism, would actually create more integrity in our journalism and a type of journalism that would be more respectful of different opinions, divergent views, and so on. And it's sometimes said by people that it's the job of the press to hold politicians to account. I think more accurately, it is the job of the public to hold politicians to account through regular elections, and general elections in particular. The role of the press in a functioning democracy is to inform people, to expose people to a diversity of different opinions, to give them accurate information so that they can accurately hold a government to account on its successes and indeed on its failures. And I think in our media, it's going to be really important that we create that different culture for our press. Because when press proprietors start to see themselves not as agents to inform people, but as somehow power brokers to mold the opinion of their readership, and when people start buying newspapers because they know it will buy them access to politicians and editorial lunches and so on, what follows is frankly an abysmal culture. We've got to try to tackle that. So change and accountability is long overdue. All parties have now failed. We've heard some really powerful testaments today. It is time now to put in place what politicians of all parties promised they would do all those years ago.
Thank you so much, George. And our final speakers today are not so much talking about personal experience, perhaps, but the wider public issues that this affects. Our first speaker in this group is Des Friedman. He's Professor of Media and Communication Studies and a founding member of the Media Reform Coalition. Please welcome Des Friedman.
For me, one of the most pernicious myths that we face today is that the press are no longer that influential, that in the social media, digital media age, we don't have to worry about them as much. And one of the people who made this argument was our very own Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, as a reason for not being able to implement Leveson 2 because the landscape had changed too much. Now, we've heard some incredibly powerful stories here today, which I think demonstrates that we still have to worry about abuses of press power. But it's also just empirically wrong. It's factually wrong about where people get their information from at the moment. By far the most powerful, influential sources of news continue to be the titles who have caused such misery to people in this room. The internet has not put an end to press power. It has given them additional platforms in which to produce the stories that have been so hurtful. So it really matters when these still profoundly influential titles are not scrutinized properly, when they are not held accountable for their reporting and the damage that it causes. And there's falling levels of trust, and it's pretty understandable when you think about it. How can we, for example, trust the international news in the Telegraph when we know that its relatively new owner has mandated its journalists to be pro-Israel? How can we trust the Telegraph's coverage over what's happening outside right now with the heat wave, when he is on record as saying that, quote, "I'm all for climate change"? And if you look at so many of the newspapers this week in the Mail, Telegraph, Times, illustrating the heat wave with pictures of people on beaches, of boys jumping into rivers, when we know that something like 40 kids in France drowned this week because of the heat wave, but those aren't the kinds of pictures it wants to show. How can we trust these powerful news organizations to tell us the truth, for example, on Muslims in this country? How can we trust them to tell us accurate stories about immigration when they are perfectly free to run headlines about, in their words, invasions and scroungers and people taking over our culture without systematic, reliable interference, scrutiny from what is effectively, as you've heard, a sham regulator? How can we really believe that it's a free press when so often what a free press really means is actually the freedom to bully, the freedom to marginalize, the freedom to mock, the freedom to misrepresent? And as our people have said, this isn't just an accident. I think press failures reflect a business model that has long been based on punching down rather than up, to attack what's different or unfamiliar, whether it's to please your billionaire owner or because simply it will increase your profits, increase clicks and circulation. And you know who I always quote when I'm doing this with students? I quote someone who knows an awful lot about this, James Murdoch, the son of Rupert Murdoch, a key player in the very history of Hacked Off, who said, quote, this was last year. This isn't ancient history, this was last year. "I underestimated the ability of a profit motive to make people do terrible things, to make companies do terrible things," said James Murdoch to The Atlantic. So if you want to stop people doing terrible things, then we need to change their behavior, to change the incentives for acting this way. And that's one of the reasons why we need a robust, meaningfully independent regulator who is not scared to take on media moguls as well as tech oligopolists. But sadly, this government, like the last one, is running scared of alienating newspaper owners precisely, not because they no longer matter, precisely the opposite, because they still fear their power. Lisa Nandy, just to finish with, put it like this when she was saying that it would be too difficult to enforce Leveson 2. People now, she said, are more likely to get the news online from a whole variety of sources, which has thrown up new and completely different challenges. As I've said, I think this is factually wrong, but actually it's an excuse. The only challenge that's relevant here is the one that politicians are refusing to take, to stand up to press power, to demand accountability and transparency, to campaign without hesitation for a more diverse and independent press, and to say, just like Howard Beale in my favorite film Network, that, quote, we're as mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Des. So I'll certainly go with that last comment. Next up is Sarah Berry-Valentine, Media and PR Manager at that extraordinarily important charity Refuge. Please, Sarah.
Hi there, I'm Sarah Berry-Valentine and I'm the Media and PR Manager at domestic abuse charity Refuge. Yeah, do you want me to... Is that better? Yeah. So we work with survivors of abuse every day to help tell their stories in a way which provides them with comfort, confidence and empowerment. Domestic abuse is arguably the biggest issue facing women and children, and so the way domestic abuse is spoken about in the media has a direct and real impact on how we view domestic abuse as a society. It can make the difference between a survivor seeking support to leave an abuser or staying with them. The media has a huge role to play and a huge responsibility to educate the public, signpost survivors to support, and ultimately help eradicate this serious crime. By perpetuating myths and harmful stereotypes about domestic abuse, media directly impacts the steps a survivor may make or the way a family member or friend may feel about intervening to support a survivor. We see these myths being perpetuated time and time again, and this has to change. How often have you read headlines like, "Mum of two killed in row with jealous lover," or headlines which try and somehow attribute the blame to the actions of the woman? These sorts of headlines often focus on a one-off action, an argument, a rage, jealousy, alcohol. These narratives fail to address the insidious nature of domestic abuse and the patterns of behaviour and coercive control that we see at Refuge every day. We also see language which leans towards being victim blaming. Why didn't she leave? Or what did she do to cause his behaviour? Too often we see homicide coverage referred to as crimes of passion, talking about homicide as if it's a one-off moment of madness, or the perpetrator flipped, implying it was something the victim did to make him kill her. These narratives must be challenged every single time we see them. Another thing the media need to understand is that coverage can be triggering to survivors or families of domestic abuse or homicide victims. There's often stock photographs used in the media to illustrate stories about domestic abuse. The one I see time and time again is a woman cowering and a man with his fist raised overhead. I'm sure people have seen that in stories about domestic abuse. Or often homicide victims are pictured next to their killer, side by side. This is often the case in local media when reporting on domestic abuse deaths. Just imagine how horrible these images are received, and imagine how horrible this is for the family of the loved ones, and how these images are received by those that have lost their loved ones to male violence. Media still on the whole talk about domestic abuse as domestic violence, but long gone are the days when abuse was limited to black eyes and broken bones. Perpetrators are finding more and more ways to abuse. Things like tech-facilitated abuse or economic abuse are some of the newer, more sinister ways men are abusing women, and rarely spoken about in the media. I also want to underscore that it's really important coverage carries signposting details so that readers and viewers know where to get help. Something we actively do is to try and get them to signpost to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline so that women know where to go. So what can the media do now? I want to focus on positives and what can happen to enact change. So I deal with journalists every day who are reporting on domestic abuse, and I actually believe there is a genuine appetite to get this right. We have recently worked on long campaigns with the media, such as the Brick by Brick appeal in The Independent, that fundraised to build refuges for us, or the This Is Not Right campaign in the Metro. or the Facing It Together campaign on loose women. These are just some examples of good practice where media have partnered with us as a specialist service provider and used their expertise to talk about domestic abuse in the right way. But the reality is the vast majority of media is still missing the mark. So what does good practice look like? We work with survivors at Refuge to empower them to share their story and to amplify their voices. We have a strict set of policies that journalists have to adhere to if they want to interview survivors. So what we'll do is we'll have a conversation with a journalist about the general tone for the article. We'll request the questions in advance so the survivor knows what she's likely to be asked, and this minimises re-traumatising her. We'll request readbacks where the survivor can listen to or review their quotes and how they're written, checking for accuracy about their story, and we will check for language. We'll do our best to make sure that nothing is reported which could put the survivor in any danger. One of the Refuge media team will be on the call, and a member of our survivor engagement team will be supporting as well. We try to avoid much back and forth and will never put journalists in direct contact with survivors. That's because we don't trust journalists to report on this properly. And survivors want agency and they want empowerment over how their stories are told, and this is vital. In the cases of homicide, journalists could work with the families of the deceased or they could work with us as experts. Too often we see families being doorstepped. So language do's and don'ts. We avoid the term domestic violence. We always say domestic abuse as it's more encapturing. We avoid the term abusive relationship. We see this time and time again in media. This implies that abuse is a mutual thing, when in reality there is a sole perpetrator, and it's the partner who is abusive, not the relationship. We avoid naming and photographing the perpetrator of homicide before naming the victim. So often victims are simply referred to as mum of two. These are individuals and they deserve to be remembered. And quite often we'll see the perpetrator described as charming man or, friend of, or what his profession is. We avoid terms like crime of passion or discussions about why she didn't leave. At the moment, we're seeing lots of excuses and dangerous narratives about why domestic abuse happens, such as because the perpetrator had been drinking or watching the football. There is never an excuse for domestic abuse, and it's the perpetrator's actions alone that are to blame. So these are some simple steps for how to avoid victim blaming. It's time the narrative is changed, and the domestic abuse is spoken about in the context of its root causes, power and control, propped up by the patriarchy. We need to eradicate misogynistic and victim-blaming language from the media. It's a vital step to ultimately eradicating domestic abuse from society. For more information about domestic abuse, you can visit refuge.org.uk, or you can, if anyone in the room is experiencing domestic abuse or thinks that someone may be, they can reach out to our National Domestic Abuse Helpline on 0808 2000 24/7. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. An extraordinary work they do at Refuge. Our final speaker, but by no means the least important, is Rizwana Hamid. Rizwana is an award-winning journalist and filmmaker, and he's director of the Centre for Media Monitoring. Please welcome to the stage, Rizwana. I do apologise. Right, I'm very short, and I'm going to speak loudly because I was sitting at the back and I know people at the back can't hear, so I hope you can hear me. Islamophobia has passed the dinner party test. That's what Saida Vasi said 15 years ago. Today it's passed the politicians' test and it's certainly passed the media's test. That means it's become socially acceptable. And we at Centre for Media Monitoring, where we monitor the British media on a daily basis on how they report on Muslims and Islam, as well as other issues, have found that the landscape in Britain has changed dramatically and has gone for the worse. And what used to be on the dark corners of the web on far-right platforms has been mainstreamed, and mainstreamed in a way where we hear it on a daily basis. When mosques and Muslims are attacked, we don't get the same coverage as when other institutions or other communities are attacked. We don't get the government calling for a COBRA meeting or an emergency meeting. These events go by without the media flagshipping them and without politicians dealing with them. And we did a quick analysis just in the past few days of the attacks that happened in Edinburgh. And we compared them to the Golders Green attacks, not so that we can have an Olympics of racism and who deserves to have more attention or not, but just to show what we will call the two-tier media system, because the far right and the right likes to talk about two-tier policing, two-tier society. We actually have a two-tier media, where the media deals with different communities in a different way. And if I just look at some of the stats that we came across, and we compared the coverage over a 4-day period for both attacks. On TV, the Golders Green attacks got 1,107 minutes. The Edinburgh attacks got 160 minutes. When it came to print, there were 782 articles on Golders Green, only 35 on the Edinburgh attacks. None of the victims' names were mentioned, there was no backstory, and there certainly wasn't the attention that other attacks got. Even The Guardian, who we would expect to do better, didn't even have the word anti-Muslim attacks in their headline or in their first 300 words. And it was tucked away somewhere at the end, despite the fact that we'd seen a video that went viral of the perpetrator basically saying that what he wanted to do was wipe out Muslims. Not held to account. The media certainly didn't make of it as much as they should have. But what we do get in the media is the amplification of far-right tropes. Tropes that we're hearing day in, day out. Muslims are a threat. Islam is incompatible with Western values. Muslim women are oppressed, so I'm oppressed. I have no agency, and I'm not allowed to even give my opinion when we try and challenge that narrative. They continue to platform far-right individuals, whether they are politicians or whether they are so-called activists. They are given a platform and they're not even challenged. So the likes of Robert Jenrick can go on Sky News and say that he wants to criminalize the word Allahu Akbar, said by billions of Muslims around the world at least 5 times a day when we're praying. But this has now been used for clickbait purposes. We can have Kemi Badenoch being on a flagship program by one of our leading political journalists and not be challenged when she's speaking about the far-right marches and saying that actually they're not threatening anyone. Was she aware of last year's far-right march and the kind of people that were being platformed, the likes of Geert Wilders and other far-right activists, and what they said this year as well, and yet they're not challenged? We can have Sunday papers giving the likes of former Home Secretaries a platform to basically say that the vast majority of so-called grooming gangs, and I say so-called because it's not a legal term, child sexual exploitation is, that the vast majority are men of Pakistani origin, when her own Home Office stats show that the vast majority are white men. We can have the editors of former flagship radio programs on our public service broadcaster being given a platform on our leading political magazine in the country and being allowed to call Muslims savages and barbaric. I mean, the list is endless. We can have a respected broadsheet that used to be a broadsheet giving a platform to a columnist who basically says that there are no-go areas in Britain where Sharia law operates. Complete falsehoods. And we have people from right-wing think tanks being given platforms in our political magazines, in broadsheet newspapers, and in broadcast programs to say that if we want less terrorism, there should be less Islam. Now, what does that mean, less Islam? You can't have Islam unless you have followers of Islam. So what is he saying? That there should be less Muslims in the world. And what does that mean? Nothing, according to the press, because this person wasn't held to account. And it's not just
Muslims being vilified as groups and communities, which is where IPSO's clauses on discrimination, clause 12, are completely not fit for purpose, because that's what we find in the media. There have been countless individuals who have been maligned and who, thankfully, some of them have won libel cases. One person, Waj Iqbal, a council worker who was basically falsely accused of being a fixer for taxi drivers who this newspaper claimed were grooming gangs. Completely false. He won his libel case, but he lost his job, he lost his wife, he lost his children, and he lost his home. His life was ruined. There are countless other people who've been labelled as extremists or supporters of terrorism, and they may have won their libel cases, but those 2-inch apologies or corrections that we find tucked away in page 10 or 2 of newspapers just don't do justice to the harm that these people have already faced and the reputations that they have lost. And we see that daily with the mayor of London, you know, who's accused of being controlled by Islamists. I mean, he's had the most vitriol, not just from social media platforms, but also from our newspapers, some of which are broadsheet newspapers, which are held up to high standards, because at one time, maybe they did hold up very high standards. These things I'm saying because I think what this shows is that currently IPSO's clause, and from our perspective specifically, the 2 clauses that are just not fit for purpose, is clause 1 of accuracy, because the bar for reaching that and getting a complaint through and being able to say that there was a breach is very high, but also it doesn't include comment, opinion, conjecture, and we find a lot of columnists and commentators use this in order to malign Muslims. Clause 12, like I say, only refers to individuals, and yet Muslim communities and other minoritized communities are constantly attacked, dehumanized, and othered under this clause and are allowed to get away with it because it doesn't include groups, communities, institutions, or organizations. And I know here we're talking about the press today, but what I'd like to say is actually the media as a whole in Britain is in a state of crisis. We have seen the foxification of our landscape, and particularly in broadcast news when we come to the likes of GB News, who have an obsession with Muslims and Islam and who on a daily basis are allowed by Ofcom to propagate falsehoods, lies, and tropes. And so it's not that these outlets are there alone doing wrong. Our regulators, both print and broadcast, which is a travesty because Ofcom used to be held up as, and broadcast used to be held up as holding up high standards, and that the regulatory system under Ofcom was really robust, but it's not robust, not when it comes to the likes of GB News anymore. So I would say that enough is enough. You know, we've had enough of not just Muslims, not just all the individuals that we've heard today, not other minoritized communities. We do not want to see these newspapers and broadcasters propagating hate and division, which end up in what we saw on the streets of Britain, whether that was in Southport, whether that was in Belfast, whether that was in Edinburgh, whether that was in London. It's not good enough. And if these media outlets stand for freedom of speech, then we should be allowed to challenge it on the basis of freedom of speech, and they should uphold the highest standards and be for accountability and robust regulatory systems. All lives matter, and we need to hold the media, not just the press, but the media, to account on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rizwanda. I can't think of a better way to conclude our speakers today with that powerful message. And please put your hands together for all our speakers. It does take courage to stand up here. And that has been so much of a theme of what you heard today, isn't it? Courage. And in order to have courage, you need fear. And that's the environment we're working in. People are frightened of dealing with this issue. And we need to continue to have courage to push back against that. We have a unique opportunity with a new change of leadership to potentially move forward on this subject. This is about the future now. Thank you all so much for coming today and taking this subject so seriously. Please share the messages that you've heard today, the stories you've heard today. Talk to your MPs, to your local leadership. Get them to lobby them. Tell them that it's more important than party politics. This is about people's lives and about the future trust in our journalism and our newspapers and how we receive our news in the future. Thank you all for coming in such a demanding circumstances, heat-wise, but we really value your support. Please stick with us. We're not going to give this issue up, and we're so grateful for you to come in today. Thank you all very much.